So YouTube is full of hundreds of people telling you how to retire on Bitcoin, but have you noticed nobody actually gives you the step-by-step playbook of how to actually do it? So this video is going to be a little bit of a different one because since 2018, as you can see, I've only been buying Bitcoin consistently day after day, but the time has come that maybe I'm going to consider selling just a little bit of my Bitcoin. And I have spent hours and hours typing, going back and forth with ChatGPT to develop the perfect Bitcoin exit strategy, which is going to show me what percentage of my Bitcoin stack I should be selling at each price point. And the really good thing about today's video is this template that I'm using, you can take it yourself and develop your own retirement strategy. I'm making this video today because I realized, hang on a minute, I've made so many videos showing people how much Bitcoin could be worth in the future and how you could retire on 0.1 Bitcoin or 0.01 Bitcoin, but I've never actually showed you how to implement that strategy. So let's jump straight into the first hypothetical scenario we want to be looking at. I want to assume that everybody here might have one Bitcoin. A lot of money for some, it's probably a little bit for some, but I think this will be the good place to start today's video with because one is a round number. So let's assume you've got $120,000 in Bitcoin today. We can see by our retirement calculator that we've made many videos on, you can actually retire by October 2027. So that means if you assume Bitcoin is going to continue appreciating at about 60% per year, your one Bitcoin today will be worth hundreds of thousands in October 2027. But you can see your first daily sell, this will be $376. And again, as soon as I say the words sell, there's a ton of you guys who routinely in my comment section correctly tell me, Luke, you should never sell your Bitcoin. And that is correct. And this is a topic I've not dived into until today. So today I'm going to be showing you how I'm personally planning on actually selling my Bitcoin. And that is by actually borrowing against my Bitcoin. Now, again, a lot of people hear the words borrow and they get freaked out. The way that I'm going to be doing it is only using over-collateralized options where I retain the keys over my Bitcoin. So I'm never going to hand my Bitcoin over to someone else and just cross my fingers and trust that they're going to pay me my yield. Again, what do I always tell you guys on the channel? If you do not know where the yield is coming from, you are the yield. But before we get into the caveats, let's jump straight into the spreadsheet. So we can see this is based upon somebody who might have one Bitcoin. We can see I have multiple different price points for Bitcoin. So if Bitcoin goes to 150, you might sell X percent of your Bitcoin. If Bitcoin goes to 350, maybe you want a little bit more liquidity. We're going to be looking at all of those options, but let's just start looking at this first example. Let's assume Bitcoin goes to $250,000 a coin. How much Bitcoin is safe to actually borrow against? So most people who've got one Bitcoin, they probably think, hey, I can put 20% of my Bitcoin stack on some borrowing platforms, and that must be a safe amount of leverage, right? And that is actually wrong. But before I explain how that is wrong and why I think you'd be over levered, let's just break down what this example might look like. So what I've got here is the 6 biggest Bitcoin borrowing companies. And again, we always want to diversify our risk across different options. So in this hypothetical scenario, I've assumed that somebody has put in total 0.2 Bitcoin on some borrowing platforms. And we can see that if Bitcoin's at about $250,000 per coin in this hypothetical thought experiment, you can see that from those 6 small loans, you would now be sitting on $28,000 of liquidity. Now, something that might not seem important, but is actually very important for our future discussion here in a moment, is to have a very quick look at how much dollar value of Bitcoin you'd be putting on each platform versus how much Bitcoin you would be getting paid. You can see the amount you're putting on the platform is half the amount that you're actually getting in liquidity. This is because I only recommend you use over-collateralized Bitcoin borrowing platforms. So that means that if you put one Bitcoin on a borrowing platform that's worth $120,000, you're only going to get $60,000 of liquidity. It is a 100% over collateralized lending process. Okay, now again, some platforms are a little bit different, but this is the general rule in most Bitcoin borrowing platforms. We've got some very important caveats to be aware of. Now, I told you earlier that putting 20% of your Bitcoin stack is actually a little bit too much to put on a borrowing platform, and these two columns explains why. So if we look at a big price chart of Bitcoin's 16-year history, we can see it's had 50% corrections on something like 8 occasions. And we've had at least 5 occasions where Bitcoin nearly crashes as much as 75%. So I think if you're ever going to borrow against some of your Bitcoin, you need to run these hypothetical situations. These hypothetical thought experiments. You need to be prepared to weather a 50, 75%, or even bigger Bitcoin drawdown, because you would absolutely hate to be liquidated and lose your Bitcoin. So let's start breaking this down. If Bitcoin's at $250,000 a coin, your one Bitcoin is worth 250K, $28,000 of liquidity after you've put 20% of your one Bitcoin onto some different borrowing platforms. But now let's have a look at this. If Bitcoin crashes by 50%, you would actually have to put 0.24 Bitcoin onto the borrowing platforms in total to over collateralize your Bitcoin loan. Because when the value of Bitcoin plummets in half, all of a sudden you need to readjust the amount of Bitcoin that you have in collateral on the lending platform must be 100% higher than your loan value. This is a very important caveat that I think caught a lot of people off guard in the FTX, Celsius, or BlockFi collapses back in 2022. And this gets even more interesting when you try to account for the fact that Bitcoin does sometimes go down by 75%. We can see in this hypothetical situation, you would need to put 0.69 Bitcoin onto the borrowing platforms as collateral. And again, think about this. If you've got one Bitcoin, most people would think putting 0.2 Bitcoin, just 20% of their stack, on some borrowing platforms is responsible leverage. But if Bitcoin crashes by 75%, that 100% over collateralization ratio that you must hold as a borrower. So this means, again, quick maths, 0.2 was originally put on the platforms, then you'd need to put an additional 0.7. That leaves you with only 10% of your original Bitcoin in cold storage in a Bitcoin hardware wallet. Okay, this is the goal. We never want to be over leveraged. Again, I've used all these hardware wallets. I think they're all great. I personally like Trezors and Ledgers just because they're super easy to use. And a Ledger was actually my very first hardware wallet way back in 2018. I was actually buying Bitcoin on the exchange I showed you earlier and putting it into one of these. So Ledgers are super cool. Trezors are super easy. If you want to get a Ledger, you can get $10 of free Bitcoin when you buy a Ledger with the link down below in the show notes of today's video. So again, we want to retain at least 60 or 70% of our net worth offline in a hardware wallet. Let's move on and show you what I think people are getting wrong. Because again, most people think 0.2 Bitcoin on a borrowing platform, that's not super leveraged, but they haven't ran these numbers. If Bitcoin draws down by 75%, you have to put 0.7 Bitcoin up on a lending platform to re-collateralize your loan. And that actually, when I ran these numbers initially, I was actually shocked because again, this is why I'm making this video. I made this whole template because I'm planning on borrowing against a little bit of my Bitcoin, this Bitcoin bull run, and I wanted to do it in a safe way. I ran these numbers and I was like, wow, what? 0.7? It's a lot. It's surprising. And again, I think it catches a lot of people off guard. So running another one of these experiments, I think a safer place to start might be something like 10% of your net worth being put on a borrowing platform, because then we know even under a near worst case scenario, Bitcoin draws down by 75%, you'd only have to put up something like 0.35 of a Bitcoin on that borrowing platform to re-collateralize that leverage ratio. So you'd have 0.1 initially, 0.35 to re-collateralize under a worst case scenario. And in total, you've got less than half of your Bitcoin or your total net worth on a Bitcoin borrowing platform. Even for myself, that's probably a little bit too leveraged, but I think those are some ways that I'm personally thinking about it, okay? And things get more interesting when you kind of zoom out a little bit and you have a look, hey, what happens if Bitcoin hits $500,000 a coin? You know what? Before I walk you through that $500,000 hypothetical thought experiment, why don't I first show you how to actually take one of the loans? Let's do it, because I've actually already tested out a couple of these borrowing platforms to prepare for this bull run's Bitcoin exit strategy. So we can see here right now, I've actually got 2 loans on Firefish because I've been experimenting with how to use them. They are a Bitcoin peer-to-peer lending platform. They're personally my favorites, which is why I've partnered up with them, because they use multi-signature vaults. So you still retain one key in this kind of vault transaction, and they're peer-to-peer, okay? This is very different to another one of the borrowing platform providers that we had on this Excel spreadsheet, like Coinbase. Coinbase, they take custody of your Bitcoin, and they simply say, look, you're gonna have to trust us to return your Bitcoin. Again, I don't like to trust anyone. This is what this whole channel is centered around: taking self-custody of your Bitcoin, putting it in hardware wallet, and never trusting, always verifying. So again, this is why I like to use Firefish, and you can see the entire loan process. I got it done in about 2 minutes. I literally requested to get one of these instant loans. I said, this is how much I want to borrow. You put in an address for them to pay you out in either US dollar stable coins or a direct wire to your bank account. Because I'm in a certain country of the world that doesn't allow me to wire money to my bank account, once I pay back that initial $1,000 for one of my loans or $2,500 for my other loan, I will receive my Bitcoin back that I used initially as collateral, and it will simply be returned to my same Bitcoin wallet to a different address, but nearly as if it never moved. This is the beauty of borrowing against your Bitcoin. Again, I personally recommend Firefish because they are the only borrowing platform that's fully transparent. They've open sourced their code, they're peer-to-peer, and they don't take custody of your Bitcoin. For me, that checks every single little checklist that I'm personally looking for. And they're even gonna give you 30% off your first loan if you use a promo code Luke. Again, I'm a massive fan of Firefish. I use them myself. I only recommend products I use myself. And I think they're a great option for your own Bitcoin exit strategy or your next Bitcoin plan. Let's have a look at these numbers. What happens if Bitcoin does hit $500,000 a coin this cycle? So at $500,000 a coin, naturally, you can get a lot more liquidity depending upon how much Bitcoin you want to put on the borrowing platform. Like I showed you earlier, 0.1 Bitcoin was my personal maximum that I would probably like to put on a platform based upon having a 1 Bitcoin net worth. Just for the fun of it, for the running the numbers of the YouTube video, you can see for this example, I said, what happens if I want to put a quarter of a coin on some borrowing platforms? You can see all of a sudden, if Bitcoin's at $500,000 a coin, I'd be able to access about $63,000 of liquidity. Again, the same caveats apply. If Bitcoin drops by 50%, with this scenario, you'd have to be putting 0.31 Bitcoin back on that platform to use as that collateral top up that you must do if the value of your Bitcoin goes down versus your loan. And again, if Bitcoin dropped by 75%, you'd have to be putting up 0.87 Bitcoin onto that borrowing platform. That would obviously wipe you out if you only had 1 Bitcoin, which is again why I say be very careful with what percentage of your Bitcoin stack you're going to put on the platform. Be very, very careful. Be prepared for all situations. If you do want full access to the template and this Excel spreadsheet that I've created, again, if you sign up to my email in the link down below, I'll send you this whole template for free for you guys to play around with this week. I think it's something that I haven't seen many people actually talk about in the space. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, let me know in the comments down below. And if you do want to learn a little bit more about just how little Bitcoin I think you need to retire, I've done multiple deep dives on this topic. I'm going to put links to a couple of videos about there and there. So click on those links. It's going to take you straight to a couple of more videos I filmed on that topic. And with all that said, I'll see you on the next one.